if you look closely at stained glass, it sometimes offers a glimpse into another world. For example, take a close look at the St. Olaf window in Bow Chapel. To the right of our well-armed saint, you'll find an austere and somewhat creepy figure right below St. Francis of Assisi. This is Girolamo Savonarola, a Dominican friar. He came to power in Florence in 1494 when Machiavelli was in his 20s. Savonarola rose to power by preaching against the corruption of the church and the decadence of the ruling Medici family. He sought to create a city of God on earth, a just and free republic where the people could rule themselves peacefully. After a few months, however, he was forced to confront the brutal reality of power politics. When the militant Pope Alexander VI demanded that he join an alliance against the French, he declined. Armed with nothing but his piety and principles, Savonarola was soon captured by the Pope's henchmen. He was tortured on the Strappado, a particularly brutal type of Renaissance bungee jumping. With his wrists tied behind his back, he was hoisted to the rafters and then dropped to the floor. Afterwards, Savonarola was burned at the stake. A young and ambitious Niccolo Machiavelli took note. He went on to serve Florence as an advisor and diplomat until the Republic collapsed and the Medicis returned to power. Like Savonarola, Machiavelli was tortured on the Strappado, yet he was spared and sent into exile, and it was in exile, outside of the halls of power, where Machiavelli wrote his most famous work, The Prince. In this video, I will explain how Machiavelli transforms the traditional notion of virtue, or human excellence. In The Prince, he insists that those who try to be good, regardless of political conditions, like the pious Savonarola, will eventually face ruin. A leader who wants to succeed in acquiring and maintaining power must know when to be cunning, when to be bold, and sometimes when to be ruthless. Machiavelli's famous book was not without precedent. It was part of a long tradition of political works known as Mirrors for Princes, or Specula Principum. These books offered leaders advice on how to lead well. Yet Machiavelli seems to be trying to impress a potential employer by claiming that his work is a break from this tradition, something new, something modern. But if this book is supposed to be a job application, what sort of qualifications does Machiavelli include? From the beginning, we can see that he emphasizes that he has a unique perspective. In the dedication, he speaks of painters who study a landscape from both the valleys and the mountains. Machiavelli presents himself as a man who understands both the high and the low. In a letter written at the same time, he describes how he spends his days with merchants, peasants, and other poor souls hungry to acquire. Yet in the evening, he puts on his elegant robes and converses with the ancients. This duality is echoed throughout The Prince. The chapter headings were in Latin, the elite language of learning, while the rest of the book was written in the common Italian dialect. He is at pains to show his readers that he has something new, something shocking to teach. He starts by distinguishing between types of political systems, or regimes. Typically, ancient and medieval teachers followed Aristotle in characterizing a regime by the number of those who rule. Each of these regimes also has a just and corrupted form. Notice how Machiavelli differentiates by number those who rule, distinguishing between principalities and republics, yet he ignores the crucial distinction between the just and corrupt, or good and bad regimes. Instead, he distinguishes between regimes that are inherited or natural and those that are acquired. He then sets aside his discussion of republics. The Prince, he tells us, only addresses principalities. Another book, his Discourses on Living, will address republics. Yet, in the first few chapters, He seems to blur his distinction between regimes that are inherited or natural and those that are acquired. Within a few pages, the 6 traditional categories in Aristotle are reduced to a single regime, the acquired principality. The main question of the book, the main task of politics, can then be reduced to how a prince can acquire and maintain a regime. All of the topics that he addresses in The Prince, whether he is talking about using mercenaries, occupying conquered territory, making laws and enforcing them, focus on the acquisition and maintenance of power. The hardest thing to do, he tells us, is create an entirely new political order. He then points to an odd assortment of leaders: Moses, Cyrus, Romulus, Theseus, as especially worthy of praise. What do they have in common? They have created new political orders, and they have exhibited virtù. Machiavelli uses the Italian term for virtue, virtù, to describe those who are able to acquire and maintain power. For Machiavelli, a man of virtù is not particularly pious or ethical. He is daring and decisive. So who is the ideal prince? Wrong prince. Machiavelli points to Cesare Borgia, a leader he had observed when he was an ambassador for Florence. Cesare rose to power due to the influence of his father, Pope Alexander VI. That's right, his dad was the Pope. And Alexander VI was the same guy who crushed poor Savonarola. But that's not the crucial fact. Cesare is worthy of note for Machiavelli because he knew when to be ruthless. Machiavelli recounts how Cesare appointed Romero de Orco to pacify Romagna. Yet, when Romero became despised for his cruelty, Cesare had him cut in two and left in the piazza. He did not hesitate to be brutal, and this brutality satisfied and stupefied the people. Machiavelli knew how shocking his teaching would be. His response?
My hope is to write a book that will be useful, at least to those who read it intelligently. And so I thought it sensible to go straight to a discussion of how things are in real life, and not waste time with the discussion of an imaginary world. For many authors have constructed imaginary republics and principalities that have never existed in practice and never could, for the gap between how people actually behave and how they ought to behave is so great that anyone who ignores everyday reality in order to live up to an ideal will soon discover he's been taught how to destroy himself and not how to preserve himself.
Notice that Machiavelli does not offer a blanket endorsement of cruelty or evil. He points out that the prince must learn when to be good and when not to be good. The prince's actions should be dictated by concrete necessity and not by abstract morality. And Machiavelli believes that necessity at times will call for the use of violence to maintain stability. Now, some thinkers seek to obscure this fact with the language of legitimacy and justice, yet Machiavelli brings violence into the open. Why? Some readers think that his approach leads the prince to use violence judiciously, maximizing its benefits and minimizing its cost. Learning to use violence to the right degree at the right moment is both beneficial to the prince and beneficial to the people. Machiavelli's reference to the people is especially interesting here. He argues that a new prince should pay special attention to the people, the lower class, rather than the aristocracy. The people are more likely to hold the prince in reverence and easier to satisfy with a mix of generosity and brutality. Aristocrats are more likely to have insatiable appetites, to think that they too could rule. Machiavelli advises the prince to beware of the elites and arm the people. The prince should also think carefully about how the people perceive him and respond to him. For this reason, Machiavelli points out the importance of appearances and reputations. The successful prince must know how to appear honest and upright and powerful. He must learn to wear the masks of piety and generosity. Yet he must also learn to behave like a fox and a lion. A fox to recognize traps and a lion to frighten the wolves. He points out that it would be best for a prince to be both loved and feared, yet if you have to choose fear. People are fickle. If it's in their interest to betray you, they will. Machiavelli does not think that love will drive people's actions in the way that fear will. So it's better to be feared than loved. Yet it's no good to be despised. If fear becomes contempt, then the prince could be in danger. Yet even Cesare Borgia did not stay in power forever. When his father died, Cesare fell. Machiavelli points out that fortune waxes and wanes. The best response to the unpredictability of life is to do all we can to manage and control it. Machiavelli likens fortune to a river. Sometimes the river overruns its banks and threatens to engulf everything we've built. Yet with foresight, we can plan ahead and perhaps prepare for such catastrophes. He also compares fortune to a woman. Like the Romans, he speaks of a goddess, the goddess Fortuna, who dictates the future, smiles on daring, and yields to manly advances. It's hard to miss the gendered nature of the prince here. How Machiavelli's notion of virtù is focused on what it means to be a man, a male figure of power, daring, and military prowess. In the final chapter, Machiavelli calls for a future prince to unify Italy. This new savior, Machiavelli implies, will not be an unarmed prophet like Savonarola, but a man who exhibits a very different type of virtù. Someone who can act with ruthlessness and cunning in order to acquire and maintain power. Someone who can learn from historical examples, adjust to changing circumstances, maintain support from the people, and ultimately establish a radically new order. Someone like Machiavelli himself.